The .NET Core podcast is supported by our listeners who have become patrons. To see a full list of the patrons, or to join them, head over to netcore.show/patrons. Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast. The only podcast which is devoted to .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, EF Core, SignalR, and not forgetting the .NET Core community itself. I am your host, Jamie Kapog-Mantella, and this is episode 16, .NET Core FAQs. In this episode, we'll answer some of the most frequently asked questions about .NET Core. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. .NET Core is a relatively new technology, the initial release only having happened in late 2016. However, it is a rapidly evolving technology. As such, those who are new to .NET Core, and those who are new to .NET in general, can quite often find that they don't know where to go to get their questions answered. So I thought I'd cover a few of the most frequently asked questions that I have been asked about .NET Core. These questions range from beginners topics all the way up to advanced stuff. So let's just dive right in. Question 1. What can .NET Core do? Well, .NET Core can pretty much do anything that the .NET framework can do, with a small number of caveats, with the exception that it's also cross-platform. Whereas .NET Framework was traditionally only found on the Windows family of operating systems, .NET Core can pretty much run anywhere. Question 2. Which operating systems are supported by .NET Core? Because of its cross-platform nature, .NET Core can run on a number of different platforms. It can run on Windows 10, Windows IoT, various Linux distributions, macOS, Azure, Tizen-powered hardware including smart TVs and smart refrigerators, and the Raspberry Pi. This list is not an exhaustive one, but it covers most of the common platforms. Question 3. Which IDEs can I use with .NET Core? Well, you can use Visual Studio, Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio for Mac, JetBrains Rider, Atom, Sublime Text, or Notepad++, or any text editor. Okay, Notepad++ isn't really an IDE, but it's very close to being one, depending on what your personal definition of what an IDE is. Essentially, as long as it can edit plain text files, you can use it alongside the CLI tooling to create a .NET Core application. You can also get IntelliSense support for .NET Core using the OmniSharp plugin if your IDE supports it. So a couple of definitions there. IntelliSense is when the tooling tries to help you figure out which API you want to call, and OmniSharp is a plugin available for most text editors that adds that in. See the show notes for a link to the OmniSharp project. Question 4. Can a .NET Core app reference .NET Framework code? Depending on how that .NET Framework code is presented, sure. .NET Core is what's known as .NET Standard compatible. The .NET Standard is a standards document which says which APIs and types a .NET platform must support in order to be a .NET platform. Check the show notes for a link to the episode that I did entirely on the .NET Standard. It's a complex topic and you should know about it before continuing. Both .NET Core and .NET Framework are .NET Standard compatible. So are Xamarin and Mono. This means that a large number of NuGet packages, somewhere in the range of 70 to 80%, which were originally built for .NET Framework, are already compatible with .NET Core, all thanks to the .NET Standard. However, if your .NET Framework code is in the form of a DLL, then you may have to recompile that DLL as a .NET Standard class library, depending on how you're using it. This ensures that the compiled DLL is compatible with all of the .NET platforms. Again, those platforms currently are .NET Framework, .NET Core, Mono, and Xamarin. Which version of the .NET Core SDK and runtime do I have? So .NET Core is split into two separate entities, the SDK and the runtime. The SDK is what we build our applications against. When we run commands like .NET New, .NET Restore, and .NET Build, we're calling the SDK. Regardless of where you install the SDK, you can create binaries for any of the supported operating systems. There's a little more work involved than just calling .NET Build, but the process is basically the same, and you end up with what's called a self-contained build, which ships with the version of the .NET Core runtime for that system. whereas the runtime is essentially just the code required in order to bootstrap and support the running of your application. It goes without saying that without the runtime, you can't run your application. As such, the runtime is always shipped with the SDK. However, you don't want to install the SDK on your production servers for the same reason that you don't want to install Visual Studio on your production servers. The servers just don't need Visual Studio to be installed, and the same can be said about the SDK. To find out which versions of the SDK you have installed, you can run .NET --list -SDKs. Check the show notes for an exact reading of that so you can copy paste it out. And similarly, to find out which versions of the runtime you have installed, you could run .NET --list -runtimes. Question 6. Can I install multiple SDKs and runtimes? Yes. In the same way that you can install multiple different versions of the .NET framework, on Windows only obviously, you can install different versions of the SDKs and runtimes side by side. In fact, whilst writing this episode, I ran the .NET --list -SDKs command on my Mac, and it told me that I have a lot of versions of the SDK installed. See the show notes for the listing. Which reminded me that I hadn't upgraded to the latest supported version of the SDK, but I do have it installed now. Question 7. Where can I learn more about .NET Core? This answer is going to be full of links, so make sure to head through to the show notes to be able to find those clickable links. I would start with the MVA courses on .NET Core. These are the Microsoft Virtual Academy courses. I would also recommend that you start with the beginner's course, even if .NET is old hat to you, because there are a number of changes and gotchas that almost anyone will fall into. These courses are entirely free, and it's mostly a sit and watch and play along and answer some multiple guest questions at the end. Then I'd look into Exploring .NET Core, which is a free as in beer ebook from Manning Publishing, which consists of a number of hand-picked chapters from other ebooks. It covers everything from .NET Core itself to ASP.NET Core, EF Core, and a little on microservices. Then take a look at both .NET Escapades by Andrew Locke and Steve Gordon's blog. These blogs contain some of the best deep dives into .NET Core that I have ever seen. Andrew has also written a book on ASP.NET Core called ASP.NET Core in Action. Check the show notes for a discount code for this book. I'd also take a look at the source code. The great thing about .NET Core being open source is that you can learn so much by reading through the source code, which is hosted at GitHub. Wrapping up. I hope that I've answered these questions clearly and concisely enough for you all. Be sure to check the show notes for links to all of the resources that I mentioned in question 7, also for a discount code good for 40% off of Andrew Locke's book or any other book released by Manning. Remember to check the show notes for a link to the full transcription of this episode, which is available at .NETCore.show. If you like this FAQ style episode, then make sure to let me know over on Twitter. I'm at .NET Core blog. Be sure to check the show notes for a link. If enough people like these episodes, I'll put out more of them, and maybe even ask you all for your burning questions. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice, and to come back next time for more .NET Core goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks.